Fish 15. Suffering and happiness. Distinguishing suffering from pain, and likewise, happiness from pleasure. To understand the nature of suffering, it is absolutely imperative to first distinguish suffering from pain, and also, happiness from pleasure. There is a spectrum of pleasure and pain, with an extremely narrow neutral midpoint. Obviously, what constitutes a pleasurable or painful experience, is dependent on an individual person's unique preferences. Not everybody likes the taste of chocolate. The feeling of pleasure or pain does not, ultimately, come from any external stimulus, believe it or not. It is located entirely in the mind and/or the intellect. This is the reason why highly advanced spiritual adepts are able to renounce practically all pleasure-seeking activities, content with consuming simple foodstuffs and with adequate sleep, and find continuous peace, happiness, and joy within themselves, Atmarama, or Sva sta, in Sanskrit. Furthermore, the adjudication of whether a certain experience is either pleasurable or painful for any particular person can vary according to the context. For example, one may have enjoyed consuming dairy products as a child, but as a vegetarian, vegan adult, find the taste of putrefied milk, cream, cheese, yogurt, butter, etc. to be revolting. For one who is literally dying of starvation, the consumption of bitter melon or cactus leaves may seem to be rather pleasing to the senses, even though, in normal circumstances, they may be quite distasteful. The term, vegetarian, is used literally here, that is, one who subsists, exclusively, on vegetation. See the final chapter for more specifics. The three kinds of pleasure and pain. There are three kinds of pleasure, pain: physical, psychological, i.e. mental, emotional, intellectual, and financial. For instance, consuming one's favorite kind of fruit is physically pleasurable. Being hit on the head by a falling coconut, physical pain. Listening to a favorite piece of music is an example of psycho-emotional pleasure. Being angry at another person, psychological pain. Winning a game of chance, such as a lottery, is an example of financial pleasure. Being robbed of one's cash or belongings, financial pain. The reason why financial pleasure, or financial pain, is not classified in the category of psychological pleasure, pain, is because, when a person experiences either a loss or a gain in his or her finances, it does not necessarily result in a feeling of pleasure or pain. For example, in 1993, a violent criminal organization, known as the Australian Federal Police, literally stole a rather large sum of cash that I had laboriously collected, by conducting alms rounds as a monastic priest. However, upon being informed that my money was to be confiscated by that evil organization, I had absolutely no negative feelings whatsoever. I was perfectly at peace with the situation, something that surprised even myself. However, the loss of my funds was, by definition, painful in the sense that it decimated my bank balance, and I was forced to repeat the months of alms collection, in order to pay my bills and to fund my first pilgrimage to Bharata, India. So, it was financially painful, yet not emotionally painful. The three causes of pleasure and pain. There are three origins, that is to say, three causes of pleasure, pain: one's own body-mind unit, adhyatma; in Sanskrit, other entities, i.e. humans, animals, adhibhuta; in Sanskrit, and material nature, adhideva, in Sanskrit. Hopefully, these categories are self-explanatory. Some suffer pain from lack of money. Others suffer pain from an abundance of wealth. Some suffer pain from lack of food. Others suffer pain from an abundance of food. The quality of the suffering is different, but the nature of the suffering is the same. Obviously, in the previous paragraph, the term suffer is used in the stead of experience, because that is how the word is used in everyday parlance, in order to draw attention to the fact that pain can be due to an abundance of material opulence, as well as a lack of material wealth. Genuine suffering. Genuine suffering, on the other hand, is the result of mistaking oneself to be the author of one's thoughts and actions, and other persons, whether that be humans or animals, to be fully in control of their own thoughts and deeds, and it expresses in at least 5 ways, as follows. There are 5 forms or symptoms of suffering, all psychological in nature. 1. Guilt, shame. 2. Blame, bitterness. 3. Pride, arrogance. 4. Worry, anxiety. 5. Regrets about the past and expectations for the future, attachment to outcomes, i.e., being inattentive or negligent to the present moment. Liberation from suffering. Suffering can be completely transcended by understanding its origin and consciously avoiding its manifestations. For example, as a child, your mother may have been particularly abusive towards you. As clearly demonstrated in the chapter dealing with free will, her violence was wholly due to her genotype and societal conditioning, neither of which were under her control. Blaming your mother for her actions leads to psychological anguish, which can be cured only by focusing on the undeniable sense of I am. In other words, by resorting to one's essential nature, knowing one's innermost being to be pure being, itself, identical with the entirety of existence, one is emancipated from all sorrow. The initial feeling of anger towards your mother was a natural reaction to her violence, but the enduring resentment is existential misery. Any physical pain you may have experienced was just that, pain. That pain is not to be discounted, but it has probably faded away into the distant past. The psychological distress or torment that you are currently experiencing is the actual suffering, and it can be fairly easily negated by a proper attitude to life. When we contemplate painful past events or possible future events, those thoughts occur, ostensibly, in the present. It is simply not possible to experience the past or the future, only the present moment, and the thoughts and feelings of the present can be experienced. Therefore, it is important to understand and acknowledge that suffering occurs solely in the present and that it can be cured with mindful practices. It is beneficial to also consult a qualified psychotherapist on a regular basis, in order to slowly heal from such mental angst. When a man kicks his pet dog, the dog does not spend the remaining years of its life being angry or resentful towards its master. Dogs have very little concept of past, present and future, but live their lives from moment to moment. How unfortunate it is that all other species of animals, with the possible exception of the very highest mammals, such as primates, and cetaceans, like dolphins and whales, are naturally more at peace with their circumstances than we highly evolved human beings. Even if several of the more advanced species of mammals can experience some of the 5 forms of psychological suffering, it does not seem to persist in the same way as it does for human beings. For example, I have met individuals who, after more than half a century, still have repressed bitterness and or anger towards their parents, due to bad events in their childhood. In one case, an elderly woman, who had an unsatisfactory relationship with her father during her childhood and adolescence, regularly evokes resentful thoughts in her mind on an almost daily basis, despite the passing of about 6 decades. Unfortunately, when I tried to explain to her the process by which she can become liberated from such mental anguish, she exhibited disinterest, sad to say. Regarding free will. When one fully imbibes the understanding that life is completely and utterly preordained, and that no living creature has individual free will, see Chapter 11, one has no choice but to quit blaming, shaming, worrying, being prideful, and being attached to the results of one's actions. Deep peace and happiness arises naturally as a consequence. Obviously, the understanding of the non-existence of personal freedom, as well as all the other concepts in this holy scripture, are also the result of destiny. The unfortunate fact is, even though unqualified peace and true happiness is available to everyone, particularly in the current age due to mass communication, very few human beings are destined for it. On a rather personal note, even before I fully grasped this teaching, and when I was a theist, I sent the following message to my second ex-wife, which illustrates my understanding of her actions. I want to assure you that I have absolutely no bitterness towards you whatsoever for persecuting me. You are simply carrying out the orders of your perverted, ignorant mind, and I pray that my master forgives all your wicked thoughts and acts. My own heart is completely free of anger. I pity you and look forward to the day when you finally turn from sin. However, it took me a number of years before I fully realized that this concept, that a human being's behavior is simply the product of their mental state, and that one can never circumvent their current psychological condition, was a demonstrable, scientific fact. This came about by diligently studying the scientific system of religion known as Gnosticism, Jnana Yoga, in Sanskrit described in the next chapter of FISH. The basis of true happiness. To put it very succinctly, true peace, happiness is simply the true self. When the five forms of suffering come to an end by liberation from the belief in individual agency, only unbroken peace of mind remains. It is completely independent of any temporal circumstances whatsoever. The common belief that happiness originates from sensory or psychological pleasures is an outright falsehood. One can eat only so much dark chocolate before the pleasure turns to pain. Even a man who fucks hundreds of beautiful women will eventually tire of his sexual conquests and attempt to seek satisfaction through another means. Pleasure is often conflated with happiness, as is the term pain with suffering. It ought to be noted that there is a rather blurry line between psycho-emotive pain and actual suffering, so any confusion is understandable. Regarding sexual attraction, it is important to understand that when a person is attracted to a member of the opposite gender, or, in the case of homosexuals, when a person is sexually attracted to those of the same gender, he or she is not really attracted to the other for the sake of the other, but in fact, is attracted to the other person for the feelings evoked within oneself. Of course, the same paradigm applies to other sources of psycho-physical pleasure, such as eating food, watching television shows and motion pictures, viewing works of art, and listening to music. The lesson to be learnt here, as already briefly alluded to in a previous paragraph, is that actual pleasure, satisfaction, or contentment, is inherent to we humans, and once we have fully realized this fact, via sincere metaphysical enquiry, we are then able to abide in the peace of our essential nature, without the need or desire to pursue external pleasures as ends in themselves. This does not imply that we ought not eat delicious food or listen to nice music, but that we should, in fact, seek sensual pleasures as an accompaniment to our already content lives, and if that sought pleasure does not eventuate, we are not at all disturbed by its absence. Unfortunately, such self-satisfied humans are extremely scarce. Hopefully, this fact will not deter anybody from pursuing true happiness. Even a small measure of progress is noticeably beneficial. The three kinds of pleasure according to the three modes. There are three kinds of pleasure, according to the three modes, tri-guna, in Sanskrit described in chapter 18 of this lone holy scripture. Pleasures in the mode of purity, sattva guna, in Sanskrit, are those pleasures that seem to be difficult or hazardous in the beginning, but prove to be sweet or enjoyable in the end. For example, studying medicine for almost a decade at university can be rather stressful and taxing, but once the student graduates and begins his career as a physician, he experiences the pleasure of being a healer to his community and also earning a considerable income. Drinking neem leaf juice may taste extremely bitter, but it often results in an improvement in one's health. Pleasures in the mode of passion, rajas guna, in Sanskrit, are those pleasurable activities that are enjoyable in the beginning, but turn to pain in the end. For instance, most everyone enjoys eating a slice of rich chocolate cake, or sweet tropical fruit, for those of us who are health conscious, but the more of such foods one consumes, the more painful it will become, due to indigestion, bloating, and/or sugar poisoning. Pleasures in the mode of darkness, tamas guna, in Sanskrit, are those that are toxic from beginning to end. For example, sleeping is a state of any science, of daily life, and from the time one falls asleep to the time one awakens, one is prone to being attacked by one's enemies. Oversleeping often results in lethargy. Smoking tobacco can also be considered tamasic, since ingesting smoke is noxious, and cancer may ensue. Mental health. As mentioned in the final chapter, one's mental health is affected by one's diet. Obviously, the more processed food and the more unnatural food, that is, animal products, one consumes, the more will it affect one's psychological disposition, and of course, one's physiology. It is highly recommended that one begins a yogic practice, that is, one of the four systems of religion, as delineated in the following chapter, in order to focus one's mental attention upon a transcendental plane, a higher goal, or a more elevated state of being, whatever one may call it. Additionally, as one ages, one is urged to gradually reduce the amount of time that one spends pursuing mundane, worldly affairs, for the grim reaper of death is prone to come a-calling at any moment, and one would be loath to face one's demise without having at least attempted to explore the ultimate questions of life. At a minimum, it is suggested that one desist from spending one's precious time in trivial pursuits, such as chit-chat on the internet, and instead, use that time to promulgate Dharma. See to the glossary entry, Death, for an elaboration on this. The 4 goals of life. Humans have 4 objectives, aims, desires, purposes, or goals, in life, purusartha, in Sanskrit, literally, objects of human pursuit. 1. Pleasure, kama, in Sanskrit, includes all forms of sensual stimulation that provides a positive feeling in the mind of any particular individual. Thus, pleasure-seeking is a legitimate aim, provided that it causes no undue harm to another living creature, nor to the biosphere. 2. Prosperity, artha, in Sanskrit, is seeking wealth in the form of real property or money, again, provided it has no detrimental effect on oneself or others, in other words, a legitimate means of accumulating wealth. Here, legitimate, is used in the etymological sense of lawful. 3. Religiosity, dharma, in Sanskrit, signifies behaviors that are considered to be in accord with established universal principles, including duties, laws, morals, virtues, and righteous living. Read chapter 12 onwards to become acquainted with the principles of religiosity dharma. 4. Liberation, moksha, in Sanskrit, is freedom from suffering, as previously defined, and is considered to be the most noble of the 4 goals. This was traditionally interpreted as emancipation from the cycle of birth and death, samsara, in Sanskrit, or soteriology, going to heaven. As one goes through childhood, one naturally seeks sensory pleasures. As one enters adulthood, one often starts to seek methods of acquiring material wealth, whether that be serving an employer, embarking on a mercantile enterprise, or seeking marriage to a well-to-do suitor. If and when one becomes disillusioned by pleasure and/or wealth, one makes inquiries into self-improvement and religious systems. When none of the former objectives provides the definitive peace and happiness that we humans are ultimately seeking, one finally aspires for liberation. Of course, there is no reason why all 4 objectives cannot be accomplished simultaneously. A truly enlightened sage is fully comfortable in seeking pleasure without going to undue lengths to achieve pleasure, and without being attached to the pleasures themselves, gaining sufficient wealth to meet his material requisites and the needs of his family, engaging in religious festivals and other dharmic activities even if he has transcended all dogmas and rituals. Most persons enjoy partaking in major religious festivities, and, of course, being liberated from the cycle of birth and death, or to be more accurate, from the sense of doorship, which is, as explained, the origin of all psychological sorrow. Conclusion. In summary, it is important to regularly keep in mind that this life of ours is very brief, far shorter than we may care to consider, so we ought to carefully study the precepts in this holiest of all holy books, and as far as humanly possible, put them into practice, in order to find the true, unadulterated peace that we are all seeking. How I wish that I had discovered this matchless wisdom much earlier in my own spiritual journey. This is notwithstanding the fact that freedom of volition is non-existent for any living being in our universe or any other possible universe. These teachings are merely additional to the lifelong socio-environmental conditioning that the reader has experienced so far in his or her life. The animal does not have to face the kind of problems that oppress man, and which are created by the operation of the intellect. An animal's sense of consonance and dissonance, affinity and antipathy, is intuitive and inbuilt as conditioned reflex, rather than subject to the complex interference of ratiocination, by which man is not only aware of his perceptions and actions, but also thinks about them. Pain and pleasure exist for animals, but it is not a problem for them, because the animal does not regret the past pain or fear the future danger. He lives in the now of nature. It is only the human being, who concerns himself with imagined opposites, who has a problem. There are, in fact, no opposites whatsoever, except as concepts, produced by the imagination. It is impossible in life, to have the pleasure that is wanted, without the pain that is not wanted. They are, in fact, mutually interdependent, and therefore, inseparable. One does not experience suffering, one suffers an experience. One who is aware of his true identity does not and cannot suffer. Ramesh S. Balsekar. Indian spiritual teacher. Suffering exists, but no sufferer can be found. Actions exist, but no doer of actions is there. Nirvana exists, but no one who enters it. The path exists, but no traveler can be seen. Visuddhimagga, 513. Venerable Buddhaghosa. Indian Theravada Buddhist commentator, translator, and philosopher. When you squeeze an orange, you get orange juice, because that's what's inside. Similarly, when someone squeezes you, puts pressure on you, what comes out is what's inside. And if you don't like what's inside, you can change it by changing your thoughts. Dr. Wayne Dyer. American psychologist and self-help author.